What's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. So, day 5 of Diddy's trial just wrapped, and Cassie took the stand today. This video is just the court transcripts, nothing else. I will be posting another video soon with a full breakdown of everything that went down in court today, so stay tuned for that. The judge says, "Jurors, take a break. We have some issues to deal with." The jurors leave. Then Diddy's attorney, Ana Maria Estavajo, says, "We would like Ms. Ventura's husband to not be allowed in the courtroom during her testimony. We may need to call him as a witness later, depending on the direct." Then U.S. Attorney Johnson says, "I am not sure how Mr. Fine's testimony would be relevant." The judge says, "Ms. Garagos?" Then Diddy's attorney, Tini Garagos, says, "Give me 15 seconds if he wants to come into the courtroom today. But we ask that he be excluded when the testimony gets into post 2018. Then Johnson says, "In my initial examination, I will ask about 2018, but only about devices." The judge says, "Ms. Garagos?" Then Ms. Garagos says, "That's okay." Then the judge says, "We'll be back in a couple of minutes." A couple of minutes later, Johnson says the government calls Cassandra Ventura. All rise. Then Cassie takes the stand. She is extremely pregnant, 9 months. Johnson says, "How old are you?" Cassie says, 38. Johnson says, "What is your work?" Cassie says, "Musician and entertainer." Johnson says, "How long were you with Sean?" Cassie says, "On and off 10 years. Johnson says, "Did you get in arguments?" Cassie says, "Yes, it would result in violence and dragging." Johnson says, "What else did he do?" Cassie says, "Stump me in the head if I was down." Johnson says, "How frequently was he violent?" Cassie says, "Too frequently. I would get black eyes and bruises." Then Johnson says, "Let me show you a video." Then the LA hotel elevator lobby was shown. Johnson says, "Where is this?" Cassie says, "The Intercontinental in Los Angeles. It was after freak off." Johnson says, "What does that entail?" Cassie says, "The hiring of an escort, setting it up." Then Johnson says, "How did you feel when he first asked for it?" Cassie says, "Nervous, confused. I wanted to make him happy." Johnson says, "Did you agree to one when he first proposed one?" Cassie says, "Yes." Then there were more. "It wasn't something I wanted to do, at least not that frequently. I didn't know what no could turn into." Johnson says, "What do you mean?" Cassie says, "Making him angry." Johnson says, "What were you afraid would happen if you said no?" Cassie says, "Thought that he had blackmail materials." Johnson says, "What did you give the government?" Cassie says, "Laptops." Johnson says, "I've handed up GXB. Do you recognize it?" Cassie says, "Yes, I've reviewed this drive. It has communication and documents pertaining to Mr. Combs." Johnson says, "Did you review photos on it?" Cassie says, "Yes." Johnson says, "What's this photo?" Cassie says, "Me in 2004 with Carrie Morgan." Johnson says, "When did you sign with Bad Boy Records?" Cassie says, 2006. It was a 10-album deal. Johnson said, Did you release any after late 2006? Cassie says, "No." Johnson says, "Who's in this photo?" Cassie says, "Kim Porter. She was Sean's ex from before me and the mother of his children." Johnson says, where did you celebrate your birthday? In this photo?" Cassie says, in Las Vegas. Carrie Morgan was there too. We are out on his patio on my 21st birthday. VMAs. Johnson says, what happened then? Cassie says, Sean kissed me in the bathroom. Johnson says, did you want to kiss Sean at your 21st birthday? Cassie says, no. Cassie says, I was really confused. I wasn't used to an executive being that way with me. So I ran out of the hotel room and told my best friend Carrie Morgan what happened. Johnson says, when you got back to New York, Cassie says, I would visit him in the Trump Hotel in Columbus Circle. His apartment was being renovated. Johnson says, what were you doing with your music career? Cassie says, trying to come up with a concept. Sean called all of the shots. Johnson says, what is the age difference between you and Sean? Cassie says 17 years. Johnson says, how did you feel when Sean invited you to the hotels? Cassie says, nervous, excitement. We're going to talk about music. He introduced me to oral sex. I didn't understand it. Johnson says, did you visit Sean in Miami? Cassie says, yes. I went with Carrie Morgan and Dallas Austin. Johnson says, what did you and Sean do together? Cassie says, have sex. He gave me blue dolphin ecstasy on a boat. Johnson says, had you once before taken ecstasy unintentionally? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, how did you take ecstasy unintentionally? Cassie says, it was in Gatorade. Johnson says, when you took it unintentionally with Sean, how did it feel? Cassie says, like rolling. Johnson says, at the time, what did you think? Cassie says, that we were spending a lot of time together. Cassie says, I thought we were monogamous. Johnson says, was it made public? Cassie says, no, I was his artist. Also, his family, his children. Johnson says, who was linked to him publicly? Cassie says, Kim Porter. Johnson says, how did Sean treat you at this time? Cassie says, we had fun. Johnson says, what was his lifestyle like? Cassie says he had all these assistants. He could get things done. He traveled quite a bit. Johnson says, what's this photo? Cassie says, Sean and I at a strip club in New York, like 2007 or 2008 Halloween. Johnson says, how did Sean's mood vary? Cassie says it varies day to day. Johnson says when it swung, could you describe it? Cassie says anger, zoning out. Johnson says, how did it impact you? Cassie says greatly. The next thing I knew, I was getting hit in the face. There was also psychological abuse. He would tell me to watch my mouth, change my face. Johnson says, how would he keep tabs on you? Cassie says, we didn't live far apart. He would send security to come find me or a trusted assistant. Johnson says, like who? Cassie says, David James, Christina Koran. Johnson says, was your relationship exclusive? Cassie says, no. Johnson says, did you see other men? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, did Sean see other women? Cassie says, yes. Sean said, I am Puff Daddy. Cassie says, I was insanely jealous. Johnson says, did you move to LA with him? Cassie says, yes. He wanted to be close to his kids who were there. Johnson says, where did you live in LA? Cassie says, 875 Comstock Avenue, Wilshire Corridor Condos. Johnson says, how tall was the building? Cassie says, no more than 17 floors. Johnson says, where did Sean live? Cassie says, 200 South Mapleton. Sean would use a golf cart to get back and forth. Johnson says, who paid your rent in LA? Cassie says, Sean, except when I had the house in Studio City. Johnson says, why did you pay then? Cassie says, I could afford it then, and I wanted to have some control. It was accepted. Johnson says, by whom? Cassie says, Sean. Johnson says, how many songs did you write while with Sean? Cassie says, hundreds. Most were never released. Some got leaked on the internet, some on mixtapes. Johnson says, how many albums on your deal were not released? Cassie says, 9. Johnson says, did you get paid for them? Cassie says, no. Cassie says, the freak-offs became a job. There was no time to do anything else but do them, then try to recover. Johnson says, how much time in your week would freak-offs take? Cassie says, the longest was 4 days, significant periods of time. Then they took a break. Then the judge says, welcome back. Johnson says, who was your manager at Bad Boy Records? Cassie says, James Cruz. Johnson says, what did he tell you? Cassie says that he was managing me with one hand tied behind his back. He had to check everything with Sean. Johnson says, how did you make money if your records weren't being released? Cassie says, I was hosting parties when Sean approved them. Johnson says, what comments did Sean make about your physical appearance? Cassie says that I look too Mexican with my hair like that. Johnson says, how did he like your nails? Cassie says, white, French tip. Johnson says, hair? Cassie says, it varied. I shaved my head in 2009. Johnson says, your body? Cassie says, he told me to work out, prepare for the freak-offs. Johnson says, how did you feel about his comments? Cassie says, it varied. Johnson says, what else did Sean pay for? Cassie says, cars. Johnson says, did he give you cash? Cassie says, yes, but he would take things away depending on how he felt. Johnson says, what else would he take away? Cassie says, my self-confidence. Johnson says, who would take things away? Cassie says, staff. Then the defense team says, objection. The judge says, jury will disregard the last answer. Johnson says, who took your laptop and phone? Cassie says, security. Johnson says, how long would they be gone for? Cassie says, however long I was being punished for. Johnson says, how often were you in contact with Sean's staff? Cassie says, daily. Johnson says, who are in these photos? Cassie says, Christina Coran and Miss Fletcher. Johnson says, what did you call Miss Coran? Cassie says, KK. Johnson says, and who is this? Cassie says, D-Rock. He was Sean's security. Johnson says, how frequently were you in Sean's residences? Cassie says, all the time. Johnson says, did they have safes? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, what did you observe in them? Cassie says, cash, jewelry, cameras, and videotapes, guns in New York, LA, and Miami, and Alpine, New Jersey. Johnson says, do you recall an incident between Sean and Suge Knight? Cassie says, yes. We were having a freak-off in LA. D-Rock came in and said Suge was down at a diner. Sean drove over there. Johnson says, what was your reaction? Cassie says, I cried and said, don't do something stupid. Johnson says, were you ever handed a gun? Cassie says, yes. We were going to a club in downtown LA. We had taken mushrooms. I was high. I was told to put the gun in my bag. I was freaking out. Johnson says, who was present? Cassie says, a driver, security, and Sean. Cassie says, another time I saw them get dressed and grab guns and leave in an SUV. Johnson says, how long were they gone? Cassie says, 30 or 40 minutes. Johnson says, let me switch topics. How soon into the relationship did Sean mention voyeurism to you? Cassie says, first 6 months. Johnson says, how old were you? Cassie says, 22. Johnson says, why did you agree to try a freak off? Cassie says, good question. I wanted to make him happy. Johnson says, where was the first freak off? Cassie says, one of his homes in Los Angeles. Johnson says, 2A-627, who is this? Cassie says, the first escort. Johnson says, do you know his name? Cassie says, no. Johnson says, I'll call him the first escort. Were you aware he was paid? Cassie says, yes, to dance and have intercourse with me. Johnson says, what drugs did you take? Cassie says, ecstasy and alcohol before things started. Johnson says, did you disguise your appearance? Cassie says, Sean said we would disguise ourselves. I wore a masquerade mask. Johnson says, what was a session in a freak-off? Cassie says, until the escort finished. Johnson says, how many sessions with first escort? Cassie says, at least 2. Johnson says, how did you feel? Cassie says, I was high, so I didn't feel much, dirty and confusion, and that he was happy with me. Johnson says, why did you feel you couldn't say no? Cassie says, I didn't want to make him angry or upset after he had shared this part of himself with me. Johnson says, how frequent did the freak-offs become? Cassie says, weekly, for a consistent amount of years. Johnson says, when was your last one? Cassie says, 2017, 2018. Johnson says, how long were you awake doing the freak-offs? Cassie says, I never slept. I took drugs, ecstasy, and Molly, and cocaine. Johnson says, do you recall all of the freak-offs? Cassie says, that would be impossible. Johnson says, did you want to stop? Cassie says, yes, I was humiliated. I didn't have those words then. I couldn't talk to anyone about it. Then Cassie started crying. Johnson says, did you tell him you didn't want to? Cassie says, yes. Cassie says, I brought it up gently. I didn't want him to just do it with someone else. Johnson says, were you able to express your concerns to him? Defense says, objection, leading. The judge says, rephrase. Johnson says, why would you talk to him gently? Cassie says, I didn't want him to be angry. Johnson says, what is this? Cassie says, email between me and Sean. Johnson says, what did you call him? Cassie says, Pop, Pop. Johnson says, why? Cassie says, he asked me what I call my grandfather. I did it, but now I think it was disrespectful. Johnson says, what did you write? Cassie says, I really need to F-U-C-K. Johnson says, why did you write that? Cassie says, because I wanted to be with him. Johnson says, I'll read his messages and you read yours. Oh, real quick. When Cassie wrote him, I really want to F, Diddy replied, you want to call an escort? And then Cassie said, no, I want it to be just us. And then Diddy says, you don't want to do it anymore? You are so predictable. Johnson says, what did you think this meant? Cassie says that he knew I didn't want to do the freak-offs anymore, but then I backpedaled. Johnson says, why? Cassie says to not make him angry. He could be violent. Cassie says his eyes would go black. The version of him I was in love with was no longer there. Cassie says, I started to feel like the only alone time with Diddy was doing these freak-offs. Johnson says, is there anything you enjoy about the freak-offs? Cassie says, the time spent with Sean. Johnson says, where did you get your outfits? Cassie says, pleasure, chess, elsewhere. Johnson says, did you get piercings? Cassie says, yes, Sean came with me. Johnson says, which one of his homes did you have freak-offs in? Cassie says, New York, Miami. Johnson says, what other homes? Cassie says, my homes, all but Studio City. Johnson says, in what other cities? Cassie says, Atlanta, Ibiza. Johnson says, in what hotels in New York did you have freak-offs? Cassie says, Trump, Gramercy. Johnson says, Intercontinental. Cassie says, yes, 44th Street. Johnson says, elsewhere. Cassie says, Mandarin, Oriental, Fontainebleau. Johnson says, what names were used? Cassie says, Jackie Star. I used Frank Black. Johnson says, what supplies for freak-offs? Johnson says, Astroglide, baby oil, condoms. Johnson says, who brought the supplies? Cassie says, security, Sean's assistants. Johnson says, which brand of baby oil? Cassie says, Johnson's. Johnson says, how was it used? Cassie says, Sean said you need to be glistening. Johnson says, were there freak-offs when you ran out of baby oil? Then the defense says, objection, Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Johnson says, you also mentioned Astroglide. Then the defense says, same, objection, irrelevant. Then the judge says, sidebar. Johnson says, we were just talking about Astroglide. How was it used? Cassie says, lubricant. Johnson says, if you ran out, what? Cassie says, we would call either staff or the belt desk, give them a tip. Johnson says, were the freak-offs lit? Cassie says, initially it was candle, strong-smelling Glade. Johnson says, any other use of candle wax? Cassie says, a few times poured on my body. Johnson says, who set the temperature of the room? Cassie says, Sean. I was expected to do freak-offs on my period. Johnson says, did you want to do that? Cassie says, no. Johnson says, did you want to be urinated on? Then the defense says, objection. The judge says, grounds. The defense says, ask and answer. The judge says, overruled. Then Cassie says, no, I did not want it. Johnson says, how did it feel? Cassie says, it was disgusting. It was too much. I choke. A lot was in my mouth. No one could think I wanted it. Johnson says, why were you choking? Cassie says, too much urine in my mouth. Johnson says, who else urinated on you? Cassie says, Sean. Johnson says, did you want Sean to urinate on you? Cassie says, I didn't want anyone to urinate on me. Johnson says, how often did it happen? Cassie says, often enough. Johnson says, which hotel charged the most for damage to the room? Cassie says, the Intercontinental in New York. They redecorated the whole room for ridiculous money. Johnson says, back to the urination. Judge says, Miss Johnson, only a few more questions. Johnson says, why didn't you say no? Cassie says, it was obvious I didn't want to be on the ground being urinated on by two men. Johnson says, where did you find escorts? Cassie says, initially Craigslist. And then they took a break. Then they came back. The judge says, ready? All rise. Johnson says, Ms. Ventura, in what cities did you respond to ads on Craigslist? Cassie says, in New York. Johnson says, did you respond to ads on Backpage as well? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, who directed you to communicate with escorts? The defense says, objection. Johnson says, who, if anyone? The defense says, same, objection. Assumes a fact, not an evidence. Johnson says, did you ever reach out to escort independently? Cassie says, no. Johnson says, did you ever not use an escort who arrived? Cassie says, one couldn't perform, so Sean sent him on his way. Johnson says, what was a safe escort? Cassie says, not a cop, and someone who would not run and tell everyone about their experiences with us. Johnson says, why not a cop? Cassie says, I learned this whole situation was not legal. Then the defense team says, objection. The judge says, jury will disregard the last answer. Johnson says, how did Cash get there? Cassie says, security, or he brought it himself. Johnson says, the escort Dave, do you know his real name? Cassie says, Clayton Howard. Johnson says, who is this? Photo shown to witness. Cassie says, Daniel. Johnson says, what service did you use? Cassie says, a dancer service. Johnson says, do you recognize Jules? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, in what cities did you have freak-offs with Jules? Cassie says, New York, LA, Vegas. Johnson says, do you know his last name? Cassie says, no. Johnson says, who is this? Cassie says, I knew him as the Punisher. Johnson says, did you use drugs at every freak-off? Cassie says, yes. I need to dissociate and become emotionless. Johnson says, who else used drugs at freak-offs? Cassie says, Sean did. Sometimes the escort. Johnson says, what other drugs did you use? Cassie says, Special K, GHB, mushrooms. Johnson says, I'll read Sean's parts of this email. You'll read yours. Cassie says, when should I take the thing? When will you be there? Then Johnson says, pausing you there, what did you mean? Cassie says, drugs. Johnson, as Sean, says, I took mine, I'm flying. Johnson says, what does he mean? Cassie says, he's high. Johnson says, why did you take more drugs? Cassie says, to not be present with the experience. Johnson says, why? Cassie says, because it was something I hated. Johnson says, how did you react to ecstasy and MDMA? Cassie says, it would make me vomit. Johnson says, what would he say? Cassie says, to continue. Johnson says, did you want to continue to have intercourse when you wanted to vomit? Cassie says, no. Johnson says, how does GHB make you feel? Cassie says, drunk, tipsy. Johnson says, cocaine? Cassie says, makes my heart race. I am not a huge fan. Johnson says, mushrooms? Cassie says, the walls come alive. And then they took another break. Then at 4:15 p.m. Eastern, Cassie is back. The jury is back. The judge says, you may continue. Johnson says, when drugs ran out, how did you know who to reach out to? Cassie says, Sean would tell me. Johnson says, during the session, how would you know to move to the next step? Cassie says, Sean. Johnson says, what would happen after the escort finished on you? Cassie says Sean would want it put on his body in the next room. Johnson says, did you do that? Cassie says, I did. Johnson says, where? Cassie says, usually on his nipples. Johnson says, did you want to do that? Cassie says, no. Johnson says, how did you feel? Cassie says, I was an object, being heavily objectified by men. Sometimes he would watch by FaceTime. Johnson says, were some sessions recorded on your devices? Cassie says, because they were there. Johnson says, if you saw them on your device, what would you do? Cassie says, I would delete them. Johnson says, why? Cassie says, they were disgusting. I never wanted anyone to see them. Cassie says, was Sean's devices used sometimes? Cassie says, yes. I asked him to delete them. Johnson says, did he? Cassie says, I don't know. Johnson says, did you ever leave a freak off before it was over? Cassie says, yes. At the Century City Intercontinental, I finally had a premiere coming up and I didn't want to mess it up, but Sean hit me. Johnson says, at what point did Sean hit you? Cassie says, between sessions. Johnson says, what happened next? Cassie says, I go to the elevator. Next thing I knew, I was thrown to the ground. Johnson says, who threw you down? Cassie says, Sean. He grabbed me by my neck and my hoodie. Johnson says, let me show you the video. And then they play the hotel hallway video. Johnson says, what are you doing? Cassie says, trying to use the hotel phone. Johnson says, what is Sean doing? Cassie says, taking my phone and my bag. And then the judge says, we will break for the day. Yeah, you guys, so that was Cassie's court testimony transcript. So that is all. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss any new updates, because you know I will be bringing you all the latest updates and all the important details. And I will see you on the next one. Peace.